The Speed Challenge. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of Bruce Lee's gym in Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the mat. Bruce, his posture relaxed but alert, adjusted his training gloves as he watched a group of students practicing kicks and punches with mechanical precision. He was always looking for something beyond technique. He was looking for the essence of the movement, the explosion that turned a strike into art. It was then that Jhoon re-entered the room. The Taekwondo master, known for his elegance and relentless speed, was a respected figure in the martial arts world. He had traveled from the United States especially to meet Bruce, driven by a curiosity that went beyond the simple exchange of knowledge. Rhee stopped at the door, crossed her arms and watched Bruce correct a student's posture with an almost imperceptible gesture. "You're fast, Bruce," Rhee said, breaking the silence. "But I'm faster." Bruce looked up, an almost imperceptible smile appearing on his lips. He knew Rhee by reputation, knew of his skill with spinning kicks and his fame as one of the pioneers of Taekwondo in the United States. But a statement like that could not go unnoticed. "Prove it," Bruce replied, simply. Rhee didn't hesitate. In one fluid movement, he took off his shoes and positioned himself in the center of the mat, his bare feet firmly on the floor. Bruce, still wearing gloves, assumed a Jeet Kune Do stance, knees slightly bent, hands open and ready. "Let's see who plays first," proposed Rhee, raising her right hand as a target. Bruce nodded. It was not a competition of strength, but of reflex, of instinct. Rhee threw a front kick, quick as lightning, but Bruce dodged it with an almost lazy sideways movement, as if the blow hadn't even reached him. Rhee tried again, this time with a roundhouse kick, but Bruce was out of range before the master's foot even took off. "You're good," Rhee admitted, taking a deep breath. "But it's still not enough." Bruce laughed, lowering his hands for a moment. "Speed is not just movement, Jhoon. It's what you don't see." Rhee frowned, intrigued. Bruce then gestured for him to try again, but this time with one condition: Rhee must attack with everything, without warning. The Taekwondo master nodded, concentrating. When he went on the attack, Bruce didn't move. Instead, his left hand shot out like a snake, touching Rhee's chest before the kick even left the ground. The hall fell silent. Rhee looked at Bruce, surprised. It wasn't a question of who was quicker to execute a strike, but of who anticipated the right moment. Bruce hadn't just reacted, he had felt the attack before it even began. "I get it," Rhee said finally. "True speed is in perception." Bruce smiled, taking off his gloves. "And in the humility of learning." The two masters shook hands, and at that moment, something more than a test had been resolved. It wasn't a victory, but a lesson, one they would both carry forever. The weight of wisdom. The days that followed were respectful silence in the dojang. Rhee, previously a man of precise gestures and measured words, began to observe the students with a new look. "I no longer just corrected the technique, but the intention behind each movement." Bruce, in turn, maintained his routine, training at dawn, meditation at dusk, but something in his posture had changed. It was as if an invisible layer of tension had dissolved. A week later, a messenger arrived at the dojang with a sealed envelope. Inside, a letter written in elegant Korean but with an urgent tone. "Master Lee, your presence is required at the Seoul tournament. Not as a competitor, but as a referee. There are rumors that a new generation of fighters, trained under questionable methods, are distorting the spirit of Taekwondo. We need someone who will see beyond the rules." Bruce read the letter twice before folding it. Rhee, who had entered the hall without making a sound, crossed her arms. "You are going?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. "I'm not a referee anymore," Bruce replied, putting the paper in his pocket. "But maybe it's time to remind some people what really matters." Rhee nodded, as if expecting this. "Then I'll go with you. Not as your rival, but as a witness." The tournament took place in a crowded gymnasium, where the air smelled of sweat and liniment. The competitors, young and agile, moved with almost mechanical precision, their strikes calculated to score, not dominate. Bruce and Rhee sat at the referee's table, watching silently as a fighter dropped his opponent with a perfect spinning kick, and then, before the referee even raised the flag, stomped on his fallen opponent's chest, smiling. The audience applauded. The judges hesitated. Bruce stood up. "Disqualified," he said, his voice cutting through the hubbub. The fighter, a young man with an angular face and cold eyes, turned to him. "Why?" The kick was clean. "Because Taekwondo isn't just about winning," Bruce replied, getting down from the table. "It's about respect. And you didn't respect anything." The young man's trainer, a man in an expensive suit and an impassive expression, approached. "Master Lee, with all due respect, the rules do not prohibit a little enthusiasm." Rhee intervened, her voice low but firm. "The rules don't prohibit it, but honor does." The coach laughed, a dry sound. "Honor doesn't pay bills. It doesn't even get sponsors." Bruce looked at the young fighter, who was now avoiding his gaze. "So you train men to be scoring machines, not warriors." "Winning training," corrected the coach. "And if that bothers you, two old men stuck in the past, that's your problem." The hall fell silent. Bruce took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words. It wasn't just about that tournament. It was about the future of Taekwondo, about what would happen when technique became more important than character. Then he did something unexpected. He approached the young fighter and extended his hand. "Prove me wrong." The boy hesitated. "How?" "Fighting me. No points, no judges. Just you, me, and what you really know how to do." The trainer opened his mouth to protest, but Rhee stopped him with a gesture. "If he refuses, everyone will know why." The young man looked at his master, who shrugged. "It's your choice." With a sigh, the fighter took off his gloves and assumed the fighting stance. The fight was short. Bruce didn't attack. He just waited, watching every micro-expression, every weight adjustment. When the young man went for a front kick, Bruce dodged it with minimal movement, as if he knew exactly where the blow would land. Then he touched the boy's shoulder with his fingertips. "You're fast," Bruce said. "But it's not here." The young man lowered his arms, panting. "What do you mean?" "Your body knows the movements, but your mind is somewhere else. The trophy, the money, what others will think." Bruce looked at the coach. "A fighter who is not present will never be a master." The young man swallowed. Without a word, he turned and left the mat. The coach snorted but said nothing. He just followed his pupil out of the gym. On the way back to the dojang, Rhee broke the silence. "Do you think he will change?" Bruce looked out the car window, seeing the lights of Seoul twinkling in the distance. "I don't know. But at least now he knows he has a choice." Rhee smiled, a rare and genuine smile. So it was worth it. They arrived at the dojang when night had already fallen. The students were still training, their screams echoing off the walls. Bruce stopped at the entrance, smelling the familiar smell of leather and sweat. "I'll stay a little longer," said Rhee, taking off her coat. "I need to remind these kids that speed without purpose is just noise." Bruce nodded. "And I need to remind myself that the real fight is not always against others." The two men exchanged one last look, not that of rivals, nor of masters, but of two men who had finally understood that the most difficult martial art to master was that of living. And then, everyone went their own way. The weight of choices. Bruce entered the dojang and was greeted by the warmth of moving bodies, the rhythmic sound of feet hitting the mat, the voices of students repeating ki-hop like mantras of discipline. He took off his shoes and stepped onto the wooden floor, feeling the roughness beneath his bare feet. The place was the same, but something about it had changed. It wasn't just the exhaustion of fighting Rhee, nor the relief of having survived that bloodless confrontation. It was something deeper, as if an old layer of skin had been peeled away, revealing a truth that he had always known, but never wanted to face. The hardest fight was not against an opponent, but against the shadows themselves. In the corner of the room, a group of younger students were practicing basic kicks. One of them, a skinny boy of about 12 years old, repeatedly made the wrong move, becoming frustrated with each attempt. Bruce approached slowly, observing. The boy, upon noticing his presence, straightened up, trying to hide his discouragement. "Don't force your body," said Bruce, in a low voice. "The kick comes from here." He touched his own hip, then his stomach. "Not the leg." The boy frowned, trying to imitate the movement. This time, the kick was looser, less rigid. "Better," Bruce nodded. "But you're still thinking too much." "The body knows. The mind is what gets in the way." The boy smiled, shyly, and went back to training. Bruce stayed there for a few more minutes, correcting postures, adjusting angles, but without the stiffness he had before. There was something different about his presence, less teacher, more journey companion. Meanwhile, at the other end of the dojang, Rhee watched a group of advanced students practicing pumsi. Among them, a young woman with her hair tied in a tight bun performed the movements with mechanical but soulless precision. Rhee interrupted the sequence with a gesture. "Stop," he said, crossing his arms. "You're fighting the air, not him." The student hesitated, confused. "Teacher? Every movement has a purpose. If you just repeat it, you're not learning." "He's imitating." Rhee approached and assumed the initial stance. "Look." He performed the same pumsi, but each strike, each block, carried intent. It wasn't just technique, it was a story being told. "The enemy is here." He pointed to an imaginary point in front of him. "He advances. You dodge, counterattack. It's not just a kick. It's an answer." The students watched in silence, absorbing. Rhee finished the sequence and looked at them. "Train again. But this time, fight." Bruce, who had watched the scene from afar, felt a knot unravel in his chest. Rhee wasn't just teaching technique. I was teaching people to see beyond the obvious, to give meaning to movement. It was the same principle that he himself had neglected for so long, that the martial art was not just about winning, but about understanding. Hours later, when the dojang finally emptied, Bruce remained sitting on the floor, his back against the wall. The silence was now thick, broken only by the distant hum of a fan. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day on his shoulders. The fight with Rhee, the words exchanged, the look of understanding at the end, it all swirled in his mind like a whirlwind. A shadow fell over him. Rhee was standing there with 2 cups of steaming tea in her hands. "Thinking about giving up?" he asked, holding out one of the cups. Bruce picked up the tea and took a sip, feeling the hot liquid go down his throat. "No. Just trying to understand why it took me so long to see the obvious." Rhee sat beside him, her knees bent, her arms resting on them. "Because the obvious is always the hardest thing to see." He looked at the empty dojang. "You spent your whole life believing that you needed to be the best. That strength was the only answer. But the truth is that no one wins alone." Bruce nodded, remembering his former master's words so many years ago. A warrior is not measured by the number of fights he wins, but by the number of times he gets up after falling. "And you?" Bruce asked, after a while. "What made you change?" Rhee smiled, a tired but sincere smile. "A defeat. Not in a fight, but in life." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I lost someone I loved because I didn't know how to give in. Because I thought being strong meant never backing down." He shook his head. "When I understood that true strength lies in knowing when to fight and when to let go, everything became clearer." Bruce looked at him, surprised. I had never imagined Rhee as someone capable of vulnerability. But here he was, a man who had spent decades perfecting his body and his technique, admitting that the greatest lesson had come from a place other than the dojang. "And now?" asked Bruce. Now? Rhee took a sip of tea. Now I train so I don't forget. And I teach so that others don't make the same mistakes I did. The two were silent for a long time, listening only to the sound of their breathing. Outside, the city continued its incessant rhythm, but there, in that sacred space of sweat and discipline, time seemed to have stopped. I think it's time to go, Bruce said finally, standing up. Tomorrow I have to wake up early. Rhee nodded and stood up as well. Me too. They walked together to the exit, where their shoes were lined up. Bruce put on his, feeling the worn leather under his fingers. Thank you, he said, extending his hand. Rhee looked at the offered hand, then at Bruce. For a moment he seemed to hesitate. So, instead of squeezing her, he stepped forward and hugged him, a quick, firm hug from two men who had spent their entire lives measuring strength, but who now understood that true victory was not in dominating the other, but in dominating oneself. When they separated, Bruce felt something settle inside him. It wasn't peace, exactly. It was something deeper, the certainty that the path ahead would not be easy, but that, for the first time in a long time, he would not be alone on it. Rhee opened the door, letting in a breath of night air. Until next time, Bruce. Until next time, Master. And then each one went their own way, one to the left, the other to the right, but both carrying with them the same lesson, that the most difficult martial art was not the one practiced on the mat, but the one experienced off it. The last lesson. The echo of Rhee's footsteps was lost in the darkness of the deserted street, while Bruce remained standing beneath the streetlight, watching the old master's figure disappear around the corner. The cold night air carried the smell of wet asphalt and the distant murmur of a city that never slept. Gotham, with its contrasts, dazzling lights and dark alleys, heroes and monsters, had always been his private ring. But that night, something had changed. Bruce took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his kimono still stuck to his skin from the sweat from training. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was the weight of years of pride, of battles fought not only against criminals, but against himself. Rhee was right. He always had. The real fight was never against the Joker, Bane, or any other villain who emerged from the shadows. He had gone against the part of himself that still believed that brute force, solitude, and absolute control were the answers. He walked slowly to the Batmobile, parked a few blocks away, camouflaged among the regular cars. As he approached, his fingers brushed the Batbelt holster, but hesitated. I didn't need that armor that night. He didn't need anything other than himself. Inside the car, the dashboard lit up with dozens of alerts, crimes in progress, police calls, messages from Alfred. He ignored everything. Instead, he started the engine and drove aimlessly, letting the streets guide him. He passed through Arkham, where the lights in the cells flickered like evil eyes, and through Crime Alley, where it had all started. He stopped in front of the orphanage where he had grown up, now renovated, with children playing in the courtyard under the watchful eye of nuns. One of them, about 8 years old, looked at him curiously, as if she recognized something familiar in that man with the long coat and distant gaze. Bruce rolled down the window. Are you well? Asked the girl, tilting her head. He smiled, something rare and genuine. I'm learning to be. She frowned, but before she could respond, one of the nuns called out to her. Bruce raised his hand in farewell and sped off, leaving the place behind. The ordeal. The following days were a test. Bruce reduced his nightly patrols, something Alfred noticed immediately. The butler watched him with a mixture of relief and concern as he spent hours in the library, leafing through books that were not combat manuals or criminal dossiers, but treatises on philosophy, history, and psychology. Sometimes he sat at the kitchen table, listening to Alfred tell stories of his youth in the military, laughing at details he would have ignored before. You look different, sir, Alfred said one morning, as he served coffee. I'm trying to be, Bruce replied, without looking up from the newspaper. And how are you feeling? Bruce hesitated. It wasn't a question he usually answered, but something in Alfred had always made him let his guard down. As if he were taking off armor he didn't know he was still wearing. Alfred nodded, satisfied, and returned to his duties. But Gotham didn't expect it. A week later, a new enemy emerged, someone who didn't wear a mask, didn't have a catchy name, but who understood the game better than anyone else, Victor Zash, the Cut Man. Not the cuts on his victims, but the ones he made on himself, each one representing a life taken. He didn't kill for money, power, or ideology. He killed because he believed that each death freed him from something within himself. And now, he had a plan. Zash broke into Gotham's psychiatric hospital, taking doctors and patients hostage. He didn't demand ransom, he didn't make speeches. He just smiled as his followers, people he had freed from their own minds, began tattooing numbers on their arms, counting the lives they would take. When the news reached Wayne Manor, Bruce was in the gym, training with a bow stick, something Rhee had taught him years ago. Alfred entered without knocking. "Sir, the police are asking for you." Bruce stopped his movement, the baton hovering in the air. "They always ask. This time, it's different. Zash doesn't want to negotiate. He wants," Alfred hesitated. "He wants you to see him." Bruce closed his eyes for a second. "I knew what that meant. Zash didn't want an opponent. I wanted a mirror." "Prepare the equipment," he said finally. The broken mirror. The hospital was a maze of white corridors and muffled screams. Bruce slipped into the shadows, avoiding the security cameras, while the police set up a perimeter outside. There was no time for elaborate plans. Zash had already started. He found the killer on the top floor, in a makeshift operating room. Zash was standing with his back turned as one of his followers held a woman strapped to a gurney. The scalpel gleamed in his hand. "Batman," Zash said, without turning around. "I knew you would come." Bruce didn't respond. He observed the environment, blocked exits, scattered hostages, homemade explosives in strategic points. Zash didn't want to escape. "I wanted an audience." "You think you understand me," Zash continued, slowly turning around. His face was a network of scars, each one telling a story that Bruce already knew. "You think you know what it's like to fight yourself." "I know," Bruce said, taking a step forward. Zash laughed, a high-pitched, broken sound. "No, you don't know. You still believe you can win. I am not. I already lost." He raised the scalpel. "And that's why I'm free." The woman on the stretcher screamed as the blade approached. Bruce moved. It wasn't a fight. It was a macabre dance. Zash didn't fight like the others. There was no technique, just instinct, unpredictable movements, as if each blow was an attempt to cut himself deeper. Bruce dodged, blocked, but avoided hitting back hard. He knew that if he killed Zash, he would be giving him exactly what he wanted. "You can't save me," shouted Zash, as Bruce pinned him against the wall. "No one can." "I'm not trying to save you," said Bruce, pressing the killer's arm until the scalpel fell to the floor. "I'm trying to show you that you're still here." Zash stopped struggling. His once empty eyes filled with something Bruce hadn't seen in him in years, doubt. Outside, the police invaded. Zash was taken away, screaming that he was not free, that he would never be free. Bruce remained in the room, looking at the scalpel on the floor. Alfred was right. Gotham would always need Batman. But he didn't need to be just that anymore. The path forward. That night, Bruce returned to Rhee's dojo. The old master was sitting in the center of the mat, as if he had been waiting for him. There were no words of welcome, no questions. Just a nod for Bruce to sit across from him. "You're back," Rhee said finally. "I went back." "And what did you learn?" Bruce thought about Zash, the hostages, the woman who almost died. He thought about Alfred, about the children at the orphanage, about himself. "I learned that the fight doesn't end. But I also learned that I don't have to fight alone." Rhee smiled, a tired but satisfied smile. Then you learned the most important lesson. Bruce looked at his hands, calloused, marked by years of battles. They were the same hands that had held Thomas and Martha Wayne the night they died. The same ones who had built an empire and a legend. But now, they looked different. And now? He asked. Rhee stood up, extending her hand to help him. Now, you teach. Bruce hesitated, but then grabbed his master's hand. Teach what? Same thing I taught you, Rhee said, pulling him to his feet. That true strength is not in beating others, but in not letting yourself be beaten by yourself. Bruce looked around the dojo, imagining it full of students. Not just fighters, but ordinary people, looking for something beyond combat techniques. People like him, who needed to learn to live before learning to fight. I think I'm going to need a name for this, he said, smiling for the first time in a long time. Rhee laughed. How about League of Shadows? Bruce shook his head. No. Something simpler. Something that reminds us that the fight is not against the world, but for it. And then, as if the answer had always been there, he knew. The Wayne Alliance. Rhee nodded approvingly. A good start. And so, in the dim light of the dojo, between the past and the future, Bruce Wayne took the first step on a new path, a path that would not be walked in the shadows, but in the light. Not alone, but alongside those who, like him, still believed that Gotham could be saved. Not just your monsters, but from herself.